January 17, 1943. The sky over occupied France is a cathedral of ice and steel. At 27,000 feet, the air is thin enough to kill a man in minutes, cold enough to freeze moisture in the lungs. Inside the plexiglass sphere hanging beneath a B-17 Flying Fortress, Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith curls into a space no larger than a child's coffin. The ball turret, a rotating glass and aluminum bubble armed with twin .50 caliber machine guns, is the most exposed, most vulnerable, most claustrophobic position on any bomber in the European theater. Below him, the patchwork fields of France slide past like a quilt stitched with hedgerows and stone villages. Above him, through the bomber's aluminum belly, he can hear the muffled roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines pushing them deeper into German-controlled airspace. Smith is 32 years old. In another life, he was a Michigan lumberjack, a courthouse janitor, a man who enlisted in the Army Air Forces at an age when most recruits are still learning to shave. His crewmates call him Snuffy, and not with affection. He is short-tempered, abrasive, quick with his fists, and slow to apologize. He has been in the service barely 9 months, spent most of that time washing dishes and scrubbing latrines because he cannot seem to follow orders without adding commentary. But today, on his first combat mission, hanging in a rotating glass ball beneath a bomber loaded with high explosives and aviation fuel, Maynard Smith is about to become the first enlisted man in the 8th Air Force to receive the Medal of Honor. Not for what he expected to do, for what no one, least of all the Germans, thought possible. The German Luftwaffe in early 1943 is still the most technologically advanced air force in the world. Their pilots are veterans of Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, men who have logged hundreds of combat hours against opponents who rarely survived their first encounter. The FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters are faster, more maneuverable, and better armed than anything the Allies can put in the sky at comparable altitude. German fighter doctrine is precise. Attack from the sun, close within 200 meters, concentrate fire on the engines and cockpit, break away before the bomber's gunners can track you. They have learned to fear the American daylight bombing campaign, not because it is effective, early raids are disastrous, but because the Americans keep coming, wave after wave of them, with their silver fortresses and their belief that daylight precision bombing can win the war without burning entire cities. The Luftwaffe pilots respect the B-17, but they do not fear it. They have seen dozens fall. They know the weak points, the nose cone before the installation of chin turrets, the underside belly where the ball turret's field of fire is limited by the bomber's own structure, the tail section where a lone gunner sits surrounded by fabric and aluminum thinner than a car door. They know that American crews are inexperienced, that many are flying their first or second mission, that fear and cold and the thin air at altitude make men slow, make them hesitate, make them easier to kill. What the Germans do not yet understand, what they are about to learn in the skies over France, is that American industrial power has created something new in warfare. Not just machines, but a culture of abundance that produces men who do not know when to quit. Maynard Smith does not look like a hero. He looks like a problem. During training, he fought with his bunkmates, argued with his instructors, spent time in the stockade for insubordination. His service record is a litany of demotions and disciplinary actions. But someone, somewhere in the machinery of the Army Air Forces, decided that Smith's aggression might be useful in a ball turret where the enemy comes at you from every angle and hesitation means death. So they stuffed him into the glass sphere with 2 machine guns and sent him to war. The mission briefing that morning was routine. Bomb the U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast. The submarine bases are carved into concrete bunkers so thick that even a direct hit from a 1,000-pound bomb rarely does more than chip the surface. But the Allies are losing ships in the Atlantic faster than they can build them, and something must be done.
The bomber stream forms up over England in the pre-dawn darkness, dozens of B-17s assembling into tight combat boxes designed to concentrate defensive fire and protect each other. Smith's plane, a fortress nicknamed Lucky Strike, takes its position in the formation. As they cross the English Channel, Smith rotates the turret, scanning the horizon. The sky is empty. The sky is always empty, until it isn't. They are 20 minutes from the target when the fighters appear. Not one or two, but a swarm. Focke-Wulfs coming out of the sun in a coordinated attack, their cannons winking like distant stars. The lead fighter selects Lucky Strike, perhaps because it is flying slightly out of position, perhaps because luck is a myth and chaos is the only law at altitude. The FW-190 rolls inverted and dives, closing the distance in seconds. Smith tracks it through the turret's gun sight, squeezes the triggers. The twin .50s roar, shaking the entire sphere, filling his nose with cordite and hot oil. The fighter breaks away, trailing smoke. Smith does not know if he hit the engine or the pilot, or simply scared the man into disengaging. There is no time to wonder. Another fighter is already lining up its attack run. The German pilots are methodical. They have done this before. They rake Lucky Strike from nose to tail, 20mm cannon shells punching through aluminum like a needle through cloth. One shell explodes in the radio room, killing the radio operator instantly and setting fire to the oxygen bottles stored along the fuselage. Another shell tears through the waist section, wounding both waist gunners and igniting the hydraulic fluid that powers the turret systems. Fire spreads with terrifying speed, feeding on oxygen, insulation, and spilled fuel. Smoke fills the interior of the bomber, thick and black and toxic. The intercom goes dead. The pilot, struggling to keep the plane level, has no way of knowing what is happening in the back of his aircraft. For all he knows, everyone behind the bomb bay is already dead. Maynard Smith, sealed in his ball turret, watches the fighters peel away. He rotates the turret, scanning for the next attack, and sees something impossible. Smoke pouring from the underside of his own plane. For a moment he does not understand. Then he realizes. The bomber is on fire. Above him, inside the fuselage, his crewmates are burning. The ball turret has no door. It is entered from inside the fuselage through a hatch in the floor. To exit, Smith must rotate the turret into the correct position, unlock the hatch, and pull himself up into the bomber. In combat, this is nearly impossible. The centrifugal force of the rotating turret, the bulk of his flight suit and parachute harness, the narrow diameter of the hatch, all conspire against him. Men have died in ball turrets during crash landings, unable to escape before impact, their bodies found still curled in the fetal position required by the turret's geometry. Smith knows this. Every ball turret gunner knows this. It is the bargain they made.
But Smith does not think about dying. He thinks about the fire. He rotates the turret, unlocks the hatch, and hauls himself up into the smoke. The scene inside the fuselage is from a nightmare. The waist section is engulfed in flames, fed by ruptured oxygen lines and burning insulation. The two waist gunners have bailed out, their parachutes blossoming white against the blue sky visible through the torn fuselage. The tail gunner is trapped in his position, cut off by fire. The radio operator's body lies crumpled among the wreckage of his station. Ammunition cans are cooking off in the heat, bullets snapping and ricocheting inside the aluminum tube. The temperature is over 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The smoke is so thick that Smith cannot see more than a few feet in any direction. There are fire extinguishers mounted along the fuselage, small red cylinders designed for electrical fires and minor emergencies, utterly inadequate for an inferno that is consuming the bomber from the inside. Smith grabs one and empties it into the flames. It has no effect. He throws the empty cylinder aside, grabs another and another. He tears off his gloves because they are burning. He tears off his flight jacket because it is burning. He works in his undershirt, in air so hot that each breath sears his lungs, in smoke so thick that he navigates by memory and touch.
The flames beat him back. He advances again. The ammunition continues to explode around him, unpredictable and lethal. He does not retreat. Somewhere in the chaos, Smith realizes that the tail gunner is still alive, trapped in his position by fire and wreckage. Smith cannot reach him directly, cannot move through the flames. Instead, he grabs a walk-around oxygen bottle, portable tanks carried for emergencies, and throws it across the flames to the tail section. The tail gunner catches it, the only thing keeping him conscious in the smoke-filled compartment. Then Smith returns to fighting the fire, not because he expects to win, because the alternative is unthinkable. The German fighters, seeing the crippled bomber, returned for the kill. They assume Lucky Strike is finished, that it will fall out of formation and become an easy target. They attack again. Smith, standing in the waist section, surrounded by fire and smoke, grabs one of the .50 caliber waist guns, a weapon designed to be operated by a man in full flight gear, with oxygen and support, and fires at the attacking fighters. The gun is difficult to aim, difficult to control. Smith is operating it with burned hands, half blind from smoke, in temperatures that would incapacitate most men. He does not care. When the Germans come, he shoots at them. When they leave, he returns to fighting the fire. He does this for an hour, for 90 minutes, for as long as it takes. The pilots of Lucky Strike, fighting to keep their damaged bomber in formation, do not know what is happening behind them. They know the intercom is dead. They know the plane is on fire. They assume they are flying a coffin. But the bomber stays in the air. The fire impossibly begins to diminish, and when the formation finally reaches the English coast and begins its descent, when the pilot finally risks breaking formation to make an emergency landing, he looks back through the fuselage and sees Maynard Smith, blackened with soot and blood, sitting on a pile of spent fire extinguishers, still guarding the waist gun. The after-action report is clinical. 1 crewman killed, 2 wounded, severe fire damage to the fuselage, multiple hydraulic systems destroyed, structural damage sufficient to write off the aircraft. The bomber will never fly again, but it flew that day. It flew because a 32-year-old troublemaker with a bad attitude and no respect for authority decided that fire and flak and German fighters were problems to be solved, not reasons to surrender. The Luftwaffe fighters who attacked Lucky Strike filed their own reports. They claimed the kill. By every tactical and statistical measure, the bomber should have gone down. The fire alone should have consumed it in minutes. The structural damage should have caused the fuselage to fail. The loss of crew should have left it defenseless. But the bomber returned to England. And when the German intelligence officers reviewed the combat footage, grainy gun camera film showing the bomber burning, fighters attacking, the waist gun still firing, they could not understand what they were seeing. They did not have the context to understand that American resilience is not a strategy. It is a culture built on overproduction, redundancy, and the strange alchemy that turns ordinary men into legends when the situation demands it. Maynard Smith was awarded the Medal of Honor 3 months later in a ceremony that embarrassed him more than any disciplinary action ever had. He did not feel heroic. He felt angry. Angry at the fighters that killed his crewmate. Angry at the fire that nearly killed his plane. Angry in the way that men who survive impossible odds are often angry, because survival is not a gift, but a burden of memory. He never spoke easily about that day. When pressed, he would say only that he did what needed to be done, that anyone would have done the same. But not everyone did. And that is the secret weapon the title promises, the weapon the Germans could not stop. Not a gun or a bomb or a piece of technology. A man, an ordinary, difficult, unremarkable man who simply refused to accept that burning to death in the sky over France was an acceptable outcome. The Germans shot down 17 Allied aircraft that day in various engagements across the theater. Lucky Strike should have been the 18th, but it flew home because one man stood in the fire and fought.
The symbolism, in retrospect, is almost too perfect. The ball turret, that claustrophobic sphere of glass and guns, represents the paradox of American air power. It is technologically impressive and tactically vulnerable, a product of industrial abundance and strategic desperation. The men who flew in ball turrets were not elite commandos or ace pilots. They were ordinary citizens, drafted or enlisted, trained in weeks rather than years, equipped with the best machines mass production could provide, and told to win a war through sheer persistence. The Luftwaffe had better pilots, the Germans had better tactics, but the Americans had more planes, more bombs, and more men willing to sit in glass spheres at 27,000 feet and fight until the fire went out, or they did. After the war, historians would analyze the strategic bombing campaign in terms of tonnage dropped, industrial capacity destroyed, civilian casualties inflicted. They would debate whether daylight precision bombing was effective, whether the cost in aircrew lives was justified, whether the Germans were truly hampered by the destruction of their cities. These are important questions, but they miss the point. The point is not whether Maynard Smith's actions that day shortened the war by a week, or a day, or a single hour. The point is what those actions represented to the men who flew with him, to the crews who heard the story, to the German pilots who watched a burning bomber refuse to die. The point is that totalitarian systems, for all their efficiency and discipline and ideological purity, cannot manufacture the kind of stubborn, irrational courage that makes a man fight a fire at 27,000 feet with his bare hands because his crewmates are counting on him. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not the most advanced bomber of the war. The British Lancaster could carry a heavier bomb load. The B-29 Superfortress would later eclipse it in every category. But the B-17 became the symbol of American air power because it kept flying when it should have fallen. Photographs of B-17s returning to England with massive damage, engines shot away, fuselages torn open, tail sections hanging by cables, became propaganda gold. They told a story about resilience, about industrial might, about a nation that could afford to build machines strong enough to absorb punishment that would destroy their enemies' best efforts. And at the heart of that mythology was a truth. The machines were only as strong as the men who refused to abandon them. Maynard Smith flew several more missions after Saint-Nazaire. He was never an easy man to command, never lost the edge that made him a disciplinary problem on the ground. But in the air, when the fighters came and the flak burst around them, his crewmates wanted him in that ball turret. They wanted him in the waist section. They wanted the man who fought fire with empty hands because the alternative was unacceptable. He survived the war, returned to America, worked a series of unremarkable jobs, and died in 1984 at the age of 73. His Medal of Honor citation, displayed at the Air Force Museum, describes his actions in the dry language of military bureaucracy. Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty. It does not mention the smell of burning flesh. It does not mention the temperature in the fuselage. It does not mention the moment when Smith realized he was probably going to die and decided to keep fighting anyway. The Germans learned, slowly and at great cost, that the American daylight bombing campaign could not be stopped by shooting down bombers. For every fortress that fell, two more appeared. For every crew lost, another trained crew took their place. The Luftwaffe bled itself white trying to stem a tide of aluminum and high explosives that simply would not stop coming. They developed new tactics, new weapons, jet fighters and rockets and desperation, but they could not develop an answer to the fundamental problem. They were fighting an industrial democracy that valued individual initiative, rewarded improvisation, and built systems redundant enough to survive catastrophic failure. A system that could take a janitor from Michigan, stuff him in a glass ball, and produce a hero. This is not a story about technology.
It is not a story about tactics or strategy or the inevitability of Allied victory. It is a story about what happens when ordinary men are placed in extraordinary circumstances and given the choice between surrender and stubbornness. Maynard Smith chose stubbornness. He chose to fight the fire instead of bailing out. He chose to man the guns instead of saving himself. He made those choices not because he was braver or stronger or more ideologically committed than his German opponents, but because his entire life had taught him that problems could be solved if you were willing to work hard enough, hit back hard enough, refuse to quit when quitting was the only rational option. The secret weapon was not a man. It was a culture that produced men like Maynard Smith by the millions, imperfect, difficult, unremarkable men who nonetheless possessed the one quality that totalitarianism cannot replicate, the stubborn belief that their individual choices mattered, that their survival and the survival of their crewmates was worth fighting for, even when the odds said otherwise. The Germans could shoot down bombers, they could kill crews, they could fill the sky with flak and fighters and terror. What they could not do was make American boys stop coming, stop fighting, stop standing in burning airplanes and throwing fire extinguishers at problems that should have killed them. In the end, that was enough. Not because one man saved one airplane on one mission in 1943, but because that one mission, multiplied across thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of men, became something the Third Reich could not answer. Not with better pilots, not with better planes, not with all the ideological certainty and tactical brilliance their system could muster. They were defeated by abundance, by resilience, by ordinary men who simply refused to die when dying was the rational option. Maynard Smith's ball turret is gone now, scrapped with the rest of Lucky Strike after the mission that made him famous. But the story remains. It remains because it tells a truth about freedom that is easy to forget in peacetime. That liberty is not a natural state, but a constant struggle. That democracy survives not because it is efficient or orderly, but because it produces citizens willing to stand in the fire and fight. The Germans had discipline, the Americans had Snuffy Smith, and in the skies over occupied Europe, in that terrible algebra of fire and altitude and human will, it was enough.